Hello once again, and welcome to the episode 5 of Rings of Power recap by me, Alistair, the Knight of the Orchards. So let's get stuck in, shall we? So the episode is titled Partings, which makes sense. It's all about people leaving various places or being estranged from one another. But there's also an overall real theme of hope throughout the whole thing, and kind of people coming together or having the potential to come together. But before we get into what happened in the episode, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the broader themes and kind of relationships to the Lord of the Rings, particularly the films that I'm now seeing in this series. So I don't think it's a secret at this point that Rings of Power is to a certain extent cribbing pretty heavily from a lot of the big moments from the Lord of the Rings, particularly the film series, the Jackson film series. I would say that the most obvious of these is the Bronway, Arondir Tower storyline, because that is very obviously drawing on the Siege of Helm's Deep, as is Halbrand's story that is sort of part Faramir, part Aragorn, in terms of him coming back into his own as the heir to the Southlands. Now, I've mentioned in previous episodes that I'm not a huge fan of that storyline for him. I feel like it's a bit tropey and a bit overused. But they did win me over a little bit in this episode. I do think the scene where he initially rejects his birthright in the form of the necklace and then picks it up again at the end was well done. And I'll be interested to see where it goes next episode. So, they are taking ideas, events from the Lord of the Rings films. And while I would normally criticise this more, because it does feel a little derivative, I will say that I think to a certain extent this is just first season issues. First seasons of TV shows are rarely the best. Game of Thrones, arguably, but that's an unusual example. Normally you have writers and storytellers trying to find their feet, and you tend to get the better content later on down the road. So, I'm fine to chalk this one up to kind of making sure that the first season is a success by playing on what they know will do well with the audience for this kind of show, and then doing more of their own stuff later on. If that happens, then I don't really mind, even if this is, again, somewhat hewing a bit closer to the Lord of the Rings films than I would have liked, at least in storytelling terms. I think in terms of characters and in terms of the aesthetic, it's quite different, and I really like that. Secondly, I really like the use of music. Music being used in this, of course, sung by Poppy, the Harfoot, and in the previous episode being sung by Durin's wife. The use of music is very good. Really like it. I always like to have music within the work for Lord of the Rings, because it's such an integral part of the original novels and, of course, the film series as well. And then finally, although this episode is probably my favourite thus far, I do think they are getting better. It does also symbolise a broader issue that I have with Rings of Power, which is that it does feel overstuffed. It feels like they are trying to cram, maybe 100% of story into 80% of the time needed. I feel like if they had an extra 2 episodes, I don't think I would have an issue with it. And I do, again, also think this is partly issues of setting up conflict, setting up characters for greater development later on. But certain storylines, particularly the relationship between Pharazôn's son and Isildur's sister, feel unnecessary, at least within this series. It may be that it goes on to be developed later on. I would assume so, given the importance of both Isildur and Pharazôn to the continuing storyline of Númenor. But yes, despite all of that, as I said, this is my favourite episode so far, and I think partly that's because it, I think, gets the closest at the broader underlying themes of the Lord of the Rings book series and film series. Yes, the dialogue between Elrond and Gil-galad. I mean, the High King is Gil-galad. I assume they can't call him that for copyright reasons, but he is Gil-galad, so I'm just going to call him Gil-galad. About hope, that conversation, it was a bit cheesy. It could have been rewritten a couple of times, but at the same time, that idea of underlying hope, of belief, of looking to the future and actively trying to solve problems, that's always been a major part of Lord of the Rings' identity. And again, that was done very well as an adaptation in the films, and I'm glad to see it come back in this series, because it was sort of often not entirely there in the Hobbit films, so it's nice to see it come back again in this adaptation. So, having said that, let's take a look at the different storylines. So, starting with what has become in this episode the least touched on storyline, which is the Harfoots. Basically, we're back to, is the stranger good or is he bad? And clearly the writers realised we would be asking this question because they explicitly write that into the plot at the beginning. The fact that he can talk now is interesting. They're clearly developing his character. He's understanding and relating now more to the Harfoots. But his own relationship with his own powers seems somewhat intuitive at most. I mean, again, we're clearly not meant to really know how good he really is at this point. And the way that they end him looking kind of slightly seriously, if not sinisterly, off into the distance as after he's hurt Nori, does suggest that they're still trying to keep us on our toes as to whether or not he is good or bad. Now, at the same time, it's very clear at this point that they are intentionally aping the look of Gandalf, Radagast, Saruman, the way that he's shot when the wargs are coming up to him. He stands up and spreads his arms, holding holding his cloak like Gandalf does. I think at this point he's very clearly an Astari or a Maiai. And while I am not sure whether he'll end up being good or bad, I still think he'll probably be more likely to be good than bad. Aside from that, not a huge amount has changed in the Harfoot storyline. Obviously, we now know that things are getting bad in Middle-earth. The crops aren't what they were. In general, the Harfoots' lives are becoming under threat, which was foreshadowed from the beginning. Again, this is a very similar storyline to the idea of the Shire, particularly in the books of Lord of the Rings, when Gildor and Glorian says to Frodo that you can fence yourselves in, but you cannot fence the wide world out. And that kind of generational conflict in the Harfoots between, say, Nori and her mother, between those who wish to engage with the wider world and those who want to hide from it, that crisis is clearly approaching within the Harfoot storyline. Whether or not it connects with the other storylines I'm not sure. But yeah, so that's that for now. And the other side of that storyline is the development of those, I'm going to say, evil elves. I'm not entirely sure what they're supposed to be. The three figures clad in white who turn up at the crater of the stranger. I'm not clear whether they're meant to be elves or Maiai. Is Sauron one of them? Maybe. But certainly their whole deal is clearly mysterious, but will probably be revealed by the end of the season, and they're clearly up to no good, whoever they are. So, moving then on from the Harfoot storyline, which again was the least of the storylines in this episode, to the Dwarven Elven storyline. And this, to me, was probably the most interesting of the storylines, because it's the Elrond storyline thus far, I would say, is fundamentally about friendship. His friendship with Galadriel to start with, and his friendship with Durin afterwards. And how he treats his friends, how his friends treat him, and how one deals in general with friendships that, for somewhere or another, are on the rocks, are difficult. How do you get back in touch with people? How do you, be friends with people again after a long time? And what I like about Elrond's story in this, at a kind of philosophical level, is that he solves the issues by telling the truth to people. And I quite like that. Ultimately his reaction to being told by Gil-galad that he needs to betray Durin's trust in order to save the elven race is to just go and talk to Durin. Like, he trusts his friend enough that he's not going to try and go behind his back if he can at all help it. And so therefore, what does he do? Well, he decides to talk to the guy and try and hash it out that way rather than going behind his back. And I think that's a really nice summary of much of, again, the theming of friendship in The Lord of the Rings. Because, but again, both in the films and in the books, there are definitely tensions between the different members of the Hobbit party. Obviously, the films play this up with Frodo's renunciation of Sam at the end of The Return of the King, under the influence of Gollum, which doesn't happen in the books and is, frankly, not a very good addition, but it's still there in the books. And that those issues between friends are a very important part of the original work, so it's nice to see that coming up. In terms of the broader mythology of Lord of the Rings, the invention of Mithril as kind of a legendary creation by a Balrog and an elven warrior and the tree and the Silmaril, it felt a little tropey to me. I don't think it's the kind of thing that Tolkien himself would have created. But equally, I do appreciate them trying to draw in broader elements of the lore of Middle-earth, like the Silmarils, for example. Incidentally, it turns out I was half right. I originally thought, if you go back and listen to the early episodes, I originally thought that the dwarves might have discovered a Silmaril in the mine. And of course it was Mithril, but now it turns out that in this idea, Mithril comes from a Silmaril, which is, again, I could be wrong here. I haven't heard that was ever a feature of any of Tolkien's work, but it's the kind of thing that could potentially have been the case. So it might be that there's some reference to that in the History of Middle-earth series, for example, which I haven't read. So that was all good. And the idea, I'm not entirely sure how they're going to play off the idea of the elves losing the light. I'm not entirely sure what that means in context, because within the Lord of the Rings, the idea of the elves leaving was more just something that happened by the end of time. There was no real, sure, Lothlorien was in winter, but it wasn't that the winter was showing the elves had to go. It was that the elves and Lothlorien were so in tune with each other that both mimicked each other. So having it kind of turn up as a kind of black spot on a Malon tree, which again, Malon trees weren't inland on. I've mentioned this before, but never mind. It's a bit on the nose for me, but equally, it's not a bad way of visually showing the fact that the elves are now going to have to leave, and we'll see what happens with regards to the relationship between Durin and Elrond. And again, this is assuming that Gil-galad is telling the truth to Elrond, because that final shot of him looking up over as Durin and Elrond walk out does sort of imply that there's more going on here than we've actually been told. I also thought that the dinner with Durin, Gil-galad and the rest of the elves was done very well, because the idea of tension between dwarves and elves has come up before in adaptations of Lord of the Rings, but obviously with Gimli and Legolas, but also, and I think much poorly, done much worse in The Hobbit. I have very mixed feelings on The Hobbit. I sort of like the first film. I don't like the other two. Although I will say that the Thranduil is a very good casting choice and done very well. One of the few characters I think is actually done very well in The Hobbit. But the idea of there being tension between elves and dwarves is done well here on a more broader political scale. It's clear that they kind of need each other, but equally that they're very suspicious of each other. And of course, in the Silmarillion and in Tolkien's work more broadly, there is good reason for that. I mean, the elves and dwarves go to war during the first age of Middle-earth. And although that never happens again, it colours their perceptions of each other for a very long time. So, again, I like where this storyline is going. I just hope that they don't get too lost in the politics, because this isn't House of the Dragon, this isn't Game of Thrones. It's based on, ultimately, the Lord of the Rings. And while politics is a part of Lord of the Rings, and often misunderstood as a part of Lord of the Rings, it's not a major feature of it. So, moving on to the third storyline, which is the Tower storyline, Bronwyn, Arondir, and all the rest. So this storyline I'm interested in. It seems to be not as developed as I would like it to be. Certainly Theo's turn towards the dark and then back again, I feel like should have been a bit longer. Another couple of episodes. Again, this is when I start talking about how it feels a little bit overstuffed, but still, the division between the innkeeper and Bronwyn was good. The idea of the people dividing between those who want to collude with the orcs and those who don't. Also, the price that is paid for those who do collude, the idea of murdering one's kin, that is, I think, a very good and very in line with Tolkien's own understanding of kind of good and evil. It's exactly the kind of thing that orcs or forces of evil in the Lord of the Rings would do to those who wanted to side with them. So again, I think that was very well done. Equally, Bronwyn's kind of turn and say, you know what, maybe this is hopeless, maybe we will have to just give in. With a different character in a different story, that could have felt quite pathetic and cowardly. But here, they really hammer home just how completely outmatched they are, and that the alternative really is death. At least if they can't pull something off, as is sort of implied by the end. So, it works there, and particularly also because we see Bronwyn being so strong and so forthright and being such a great leader, and then ultimately her despair makes sense. So yeah, I think that storyline works well. The budding kind of relationship between Theo and Arondir as kind of a surrogate father, that's also quite nice. Again, I'm not a huge fan of the idea of like the love between Bronwyn and Arondir. That I don't like. That I think should have just been cut entirely. But the broader storyline I think here is actually pretty good. And of course, talking about the father, if he is Maegor, or is intended to be Maegor, who is, if you don't know, one of the elves who... He is the son of Feanor, who ends up attempting to claim a Silmaril at the end of the First Age, but because of all the horrible things he's done in order to get hold of the Silmaril, it burns him and he ends up wandering the earth forever. If it is Maegor, I think that's an interesting attempt to bring in a character from the Silmarillion without really saying that you're doing that. On the other hand, Tolkien does make it very clear that no elf has ever fallen to darkness, not even Feanor. So making an elf into a member of the evil faction would be kind of at fundamental odds with Tolkien's own mythology. But equally, I'm not one to sort of say you can't do something like that just because of that. Frankly, I'm more interested in keeping like the tone and the themes of an adaptation correct, rather than specific like lore or bestiary or anything like that. Because frankly, that's the kind of thing that you can play around with more in adaptation, and you often have to. But yeah, so that storyline continues, and obviously the big battle there will be in the next episode, episode 6, as it's kind of clear that with the intervention of the Númenóreans, things are going to take a very interesting path. So that's enough of that. On to the main storyline of this episode, which has many sub-storylines, and I'll try to remember all of them, which is the Númenórean storyline. The main story, of course, being the build-up to the invasion of the Southlands and coming to the aid of the people there against the orcs. Lots of sub-storylines here. The relationship between Halbrand and Galadriel, the relationship between Galadriel and the Queen Regent, the relationship between Pharazôn and his son, the relationship between Isildur's sister and Pharazôn's son, and the relationship between Isildur and his friends. But to kind of broadly summarise, I think the broad theme here throughout most of these storylines is about friendship and coming together. Because Galadriel does her customary, at this point, pig-headedness when she tries to drag Halbrand into her plan without informing him, gets rebuffed, and then effectively has to go and eat humble pie and apologise and convince him directly, as she should have done to start with. One of the things with Galadriel's character that I really like is that her pig-headedness and her stubbornness and her unwillingness to deviate from her path is actually a real negative for her. And it's only really when she starts thinking outside the box and actively relating to other people, that's when she's able to get what she wants. It fits this idea of her being this very stubborn, internally quite angry person who perhaps learns tolerance and internal peace throughout this series. Much as I mentioned before, Elrond seems to go from being more placative and conciliatory, and then by the Lord of the Rings, he's obviously grown more of a kind of backbone. So interesting to see them crossing paths in that way, on their way to becoming their versions in the Lord of the Rings. But so Galadriel's storyline is also fun little training fight scene montage with the Sea Cadets. That was good fun, and of course her relationship with Halbrand is ultimately repaired. He does decide to take up his destiny, even though, as we know, he has clearly colluded with the Dark Powers to a certain extent, and that will clearly come out at some point, if not next episode or this season, then certainly next season. That will be an interesting plot point, that, can he still be king if he has colluded before with the powers of evil? So then, moving on from that storyline, finally, the other thing I wanted to say was talking about the relationship to Lord of the Rings. Tar Palantir, the king, the High King, his position reminds me a lot of Theoden's pre-Gandalf turning up. And they've clearly gone with that idea of the kind of old man in his dotage who needs others to do things for him. And I do wonder if maybe they'll do a similar thing to what Gandalf does to Theoden and bring Tar Palantir out of that. Or maybe not. We'll see what direction they take with it. So then, with the smaller storylines, I think the relationship between Isildur's sister and Pharazôn's son, I'm not a huge fan of that. I do like that Isildur's sister is presenting a kind of understandable and sympathetic opposition to the coming war. Because, from her perspective, she's seeing her brother and her friends go off potentially to die. And for what? Obviously we know why, and we know why it's important, but she doesn't. And it is nice to have a character there who is opposing the right thing, but in a way that is sympathetic and understandable given the position that she's in. I also don't quite understand, this needed to be set up more, because the idea that Pharazôn's son would be willing to go ahead and take part in active destruction of Númenórean property, something that could potentially get him into serious hot water for the sake of a woman he barely knows, seems off to me. Again, that relationship needed more meat on it, but before I could accept something like that. Of course, as a friend pointed out to me, there's also the question of why did they just believe Isildur? But as in why did Elendil and the guards just accept his story as about why he and Pharazôn's son were there? But of course, given that both Elendil and Pharazôn are two of the most powerful people in Númenor, we can expect that would be hushed and brushed under the rug. So I think that's quite feasible, even if it's perhaps a bit too cynical for this show as a whole. Pharazôn's plan of imperialism is very interesting to me, because that's effectively what Númenor ends up doing to Middle-earth. Or, of course, in the books, in the Silmarillion, it's already done this. This is setting the imperialism much later, because by this point in the Silmarillion, Númenor was already an imperial power that had outposts and was colonizing and extracting resources from all across Middle-earth. And that was explicitly a bad thing. Tolkien took a dim view of that in the Silmarillion. So they've clearly made Númenor more isolationist in this version, and then put the imperialism towards the end of its history rather than more towards the middle, as it is in the Silmarillion. But again, that's fine. It works. So Pharazôn's idea of making the Southlands into a vassal state and colonizing it fits well with the kind of person that he is in the books, which again, as I mentioned before, in the books he's a sea captain rather than a more political figure, but similar trajectory for him. And so that was good to get his plan, and of course we will know more about it as it comes up. I'm thinking that's probably going to be more of a next season than this season thing, though. And of course Isildur and his friends. Again, I thought that was quite a nice little storyline about ultimately how does one come to terms with doing wrong to one's friends, and sometimes you can't really apologize for doing something. You have to make it right some other way and prove yourself. And that's ultimately what Isildur does, even if it's a bit, based on him originally wanting to stow away. Yes, so I think that's all of the Númenórean storylines done. And finally, I liked the ending shots of the ships going out. I liked also how the armor and weaponry of the Sea Guard. It looks like the kind of thing. It looks like an earlier version of the plate mail armor that Gondor has in the film series. Particularly the kind of winged helmet worn by Elendil looks very like the guard captain of Gondor's helmet from The Lord of the Rings. So yes, a lot to like in this episode. Good theming. Theming that works with the original work and jumps off from it, and of course the build up to a big action scene at the guard tower in the next episode. So I will do my reaction to that as well. So please stick around for more Lord of the Rings and now Elden Ring content as well. So do please like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.